Welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. I'm Michael Friedman, the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the Kalb Report public broadcasting series moderated by journalist Marvin Kalb. We thank you for joining us today for our virtual Newsmaker event with Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health. We're pleased to accept questions from our audience, especially our journalists tuning in today. I'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. The National Institutes of Health, or NIH, a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, is our nation's medical research agency. It's the largest public funder of biomedical research in the world, investing more than $32 billion a year to enhance life and reduce illness and disability. NIH comprises 27 different components, each with its own specific research agenda, often focusing on particular diseases or body systems. All but 3 of these components receive their funding directly from Congress. The Office of the Director is the central office responsible for setting policy for NIH and for planning, managing, and coordinating the programs and activities of all of the NIH components. In 2009, Dr. Francis Collins was appointed by former President Barack Obama to serve as the 16th director of NIH, and he was selected by President Trump to continue in that position in the current administration. Dr. Collins is a physician geneticist noted for his landmark discoveries of disease genes. He served as director of the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH from 1993 through 2008, where he led the International Human Genome Project. For his efforts, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama in 2005. Dr. Collins, in this perilous year of the coronavirus pandemic and the historic efforts underway to develop an effective vaccine, we are honored to welcome you to the National Press Club and to say that our virtual podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be able to be your virtual newsmaker here today in this special year, 2020, where everything's a little different than we thought it was going to be just a year ago. I'm speaking to you from my home office in Chevy Chase. Those are my books behind me there, and this is where I've been for most of the last 8 months, trying to run the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, the National Institutes of Health, with a budget of $42 billion a year, generously provided to us by the Congress on behalf of the taxpayers, at a time where medical research is actually making remarkable advances across the board in many areas, from basic science to clinical trials and everything in between, whether we're talking about diabetes or heart disease or cancer or rare diseases or common diseases or infectious diseases. NIH is in the middle of all that, and when you hear about a breakthrough in any of those areas, it's likely that it was funds from NIH that supported it. Just to quickly explain how that works, most of our budget, 83% of it, goes out in grants that are peer-reviewed to all those institutions across the country and some outside the country that send us their best ideas about what they think they could do if they had the resources to support it. And we put them through this very rigorous peer review process. And we're still only able to fund about 1 out of 5 of those applications. So that's the cream of the crop, the best there is. And we provide them with the resources, and then they go out and make discoveries that are transforming our understanding of how life works and how disease happens. And that is why this is such a remarkable moment in history. We're understanding things like how the brain works and what that means about Alzheimer's disease. We're figuring out how you can read the instructions in individual cells. We're developing gene editing approaches, like just won the Nobel Prize a couple of weeks ago, and applying them to cure diseases like sickle cell. So there's a lot going on. But this year, being 2020, being the worst global pandemic in more than a century, our focus has turned very intensively to the effort to try to figure out how we can get the best science brought to bear to develop diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines against this virus, this coronavirus, this guy, which I show you a model of here, a circular little devil here with on its surface these spike proteins, which enable this virus to get inside your cells if it happens to be able to do so because you've inhaled it. And those spike proteins latch on to a cell in your respiratory tree, find their way into that cell, and then turn that cell into a factory to make lots and lots of copies of itself. And on that cycle goes. And yes, this is a virus we really didn't know anything about until January. And here we are in October with a remarkable set of scientific advances that have happened that I want to briefly tell you about. And then I'm looking forward to hearing the questions from the group that has submitted them in advance and some that are going to submit them right now. So please do. First, let me say, we are at a very serious moment in this COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. People may have somehow gotten complacent after we had this terrible experience in March, April, and May, particularly in New York, of a great deal of a number of people who fell ill, and many of whom were in ICUs, and many of whom died. And efforts were made to try to do everything possible to tamp that down, and it looked like things were getting better. But then we had the big outbreak in the Southeast, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Arizona, California, Texas. That led to a great number of increased cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And then that started to get better, again, because people took the appropriate measures of public health protection for themselves. But now we're in the third bump in this. I don't want to call it the third wave. In a certain way, we're still in the first wave because we never really drove the infections down to the baseline. But now we're in a very serious place. Yesterday, there were 75,064 new cases of COVID-19. That's the second highest recorded in the United States since this started. And I'd be willing to bet that we'll have, sadly, a new record higher than that in the course of the next few days because the curve is going straight up. This time, it's in the middle of the country, the Midwest and stretching over to the Rocky Mountains, and particularly in places like Wisconsin and the Dakotas and Montana and Iowa and Missouri, all of those places. And it's not just in the cities, which is what people were kind of getting used to. It's in rural areas. This is a very infectious virus. And it's diabolically infectious in that about 40% of the people who get infected with this don't have symptoms. They don't know they have it, and yet they're spreading it by being out in the public area unless they're doing something like wearing a mask to prevent that. We haven't really seen a virus quite like that before, and that's why this has been so difficult to try to manage. And that's why it is so critical for all of us, recognizing that that is how this virus behaves, to take responsibility, not to be that unwitting super spreader that happens to have the virus, doesn't know it, and then is giving it to other vulnerable people. This really does become a moment where all Americans have to recognize that each of us individually has a responsibility if we want to turn this around. Because I'm going to talk to you about vaccines, but we don't have them yet. And it's going to be a tough season here as people are more indoors because of cold weather, and we know that's the time where viruses like this start to spread, and we can see they are. All the more reason we've got to take actions in a very serious way. That means wearing your mask when you go outside. That means staying 6 feet apart. That means not congregating inside where you might have the greatest chance of spreading this, especially if you took off a mask. Please don't do that. And by the way, it also means getting your flu shot because we don't need to have a double problem this fall of COVID and flu at the same time. So that's my exhortation to all of you. But now let me talk about the science because that's how I spend 100 hours a week of my time. That's about what it is right now because of the intensity. We are working on diagnostic tests. NIH has a whole program there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if people want to ask questions, we have developed 22 new ways to do a test to find out whether somebody is infected with this virus, even if they don't have any symptoms. And those are many of them what you'd call point of care tests, where they can be done in a particular location where you want the answer right away. So for instance, a nursing home where you want the staff to be tested before they start their shift to be sure they've not brought this into that space. So there's a lot happening in the testing arena. And one of my hoped for, fervently needed efforts is to have wider and wider asymptomatic tests with point of care that gives you a quick answer. If we knew more of that, we could get people isolated before they've infected others. But let me talk about treatments. You've no doubt seen in case of the president's illness, the treatments were offered, in that case, a drug called remdesivir. That's a drug which NIH, working with the company Gilead, designed and carried out a very vigorous and early trial so that by May, we knew that that drug appeared to provide benefits to people who are quite sick with COVID-19. And just this week, FDA has granted full approval of remdesivir. It's an antiviral. Basically, it gets into the virus and kind of clogs up its gears so it can't replicate itself. And that's what you want to have happen. We know that steroids, dexamethasone, can also be helpful for people who have serious lung disease. The president also received that. We have shown in several trials that that reduces the likelihood of people ending up on a ventilator or even dying. Those two, therefore, everybody agrees are beneficial. And then there are a lot of things that are kind of on the way. And one that has gotten a lot of attention is this whole idea of monoclonal antibodies. What the heck are those? Well, we know that people who have had COVID-19 and survived, they've survived because their immune system made antibodies against the virus. So could we learn from them and turn their antibodies into a product that could be given to people who haven't made their own yet and might be getting pretty sick? And that would be a very powerful strategy, and it's worked for a few other things. It worked for Ebola, for instance. So there are a couple of companies, and particularly Lilly and Regeneron, that are far along with developing these monoclonal antibodies derived from COVID-19 survivors, turned into very purified pharmaceutical products and put into trials. And it does look encouraging, but not yet definite and not yet FDA approved, that those kinds of interventions for people who are fairly recently infected will provide some benefit. It may not be so good after a while, because you wait 10 days, you probably started to make your own antibodies. So do you need somebody else's at that point? It's probably going to turn out that this will be particularly useful early on, or maybe even for prevention. Give somebody an antibody before they see the virus. We are thinking about that in a place like a nursing home, for instance. So therapeutics are coming along. We have this public-private partnership involving 20 pharmaceutical companies, NIH, FDA, CDC, a bunch of other agencies working on that together in a way that's never happened before. A partnership that normally would take about 2 years to put together, because I've done some of those in my 11 years as NIH director. This was put together in 2 weeks because the urgency required it. But now let's talk about vaccines, because that's what everybody wants to talk about, and I totally get that. If we really want to put COVID-19 in the rearview mirror, we have to come up with a way that our population develops immunity. Maybe as many as 70 or 80% of us developing immunity would be enough for this virus really not to be able to continue to replicate. It would start to fade away at that point, but we're a long way from that right now. Even in places like New York that had a lot of infection, maybe 20% have now got immunity because of having recovered from the illness. That's not nearly enough. The way we're going to get to that 70 or 80% is going to be a vaccine. So we knew that. Vaccines have been such an incredible gift to humanity ever since Jenner and smallpox was figured out. And we have developed ways to do this in the course of the last few years that are much faster and we think potentially much safer than in the previous methods. And so on January 10th, when the Chinese actually released the sequence, the letters of the code of this SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, within 48 hours, the vaccine was being designed at the Vaccine Research Center at NIH. And then working with a company called Moderna, within 65 days, that already went into phase 1 trials. The first patients, volunteers were getting injected. That is light years ahead of any vaccine effort that's ever been mounted before at that scale. Now, phase 1 looked really good. The people who got the injection basically had the sore arm, but not much else. And when you tested them, they developed antibody levels that were very impressive, very similar to what you'd see in somebody who'd actually had the real disease and gotten better. So that meant it was time to start scaling that up. And that trial and another one from Pfizer started on July 27th, enrolling participants. We at NIH, working with other companies, have set up a way that these trials can be done in what you call a harmonized master protocol, so that they're all very similar in their design. They're very rigorous. They're very large scale. All of them involve at least 30,000 participants. And they have an agreed upon standard, which FDA has put forward, about what would be considered safety and what would be considered efficacy. And nobody is going to get their vaccine approved until that happens. The Moderna trial, the one that I know most about because they have been a partner with NIH from the beginning, announced just yesterday that they have completed their enrollment of 30,000 participants. And working with them, we've also made sure that this is a diverse group of participants. 37% of those people are people of color. We want to do that because this disease has hit people of color particularly hard. And so you want to know, does the vaccine really work in those communities? It also has a generous number of individuals who have chronic illnesses. We need to know that too. And we have a lot of people who are over 65. We need to know that too. So this trial is now reached the point where they will start looking to see, have people actually been protected by the vaccine from getting sick? And how do you know that? Well, you have to do this the way that we have learned over the decades is the only way to be sure. So this is a randomized controlled trial. That means if you signed up for this trial and went through all the process and did the consent, you would get an injection and you would not know whether that was the active vaccine or whether that was a placebo. And it was a 50-50 chance. And then we follow those 30,000 people, 15,000 of them got the vaccine, 15,000 didn't. And we look to see, and they're all in areas where the virus is spreading, particularly in the southeast and the middle of the country, and see who gets sick. And the question is, are the people who got the actual active vaccine getting a whole lot less cases of COVID-19, which would tell you that it worked? And also, are they doing okay? Are there any safety issues that pop up? That's what we're going to be doing. This is now one of the 4 vaccines that has started its phase 3 trial. 2 of them have been on a temporary hold because of a concern about a single patient that had an outcome that was concerning, but may have nothing to do with the vaccine. You have this many people, it's not surprising that somebody develops a medical problem. In fact, it would be surprising with this many people, you didn't have some of that. So we're waiting to see with those trials whether they get started back up again. But 2 of them are moving along without that and are in a place now where I think it's reasonably likely by late November that it will be possible to say it looks like one of these is working, and then it'll be up to the FDA to look at that data, and they had a big meeting about this yesterday, to decide whether they've met the standard and should be issued an emergency use authorization. If that happens, then it would be safe to start administering that vaccine to those who want it, who are at high risk. And you don't want to start giving the vaccine to just anybody because we're going to have a limited number of doses for a while. Although there will be a lot of doses. Operation Warp Speed, which was put in place back in May to try to think about all these things, has already paid for the manufacturing of hundreds of millions of doses of these various vaccines in order to have them ready if the vaccine turns out to be successful. So there will be probably 100 million by January and more after that. We don't know, though, whether the vaccines are going to work. And there's a fair chance that one or more of these will fail for some reason, and we'll just have to throw those doses out. But if you're trying to end a terrible pandemic, you don't want to find yourself along about December or January saying, hooray, we have a vaccine that works. Oh, well, it's going to take another 6 months before we have doses to give to the people who need it. We would not let that happen. So this is an unprecedented way to prepare. So that's all happening with NIH, working with our partners, with industry, with Operation Warp Speed. And I saw the front page of the Washington Post today writing a very positive story about what's happening with COVID-19. We don't see a lot of this. And it was positive because of the science and because the way in which the vaccine development has gone has been unprecedented. One of the commentators said, flawless. You don't expect to see that. We're not done yet. Something could still go wrong. We could define that somehow these vaccines don't work. But at the moment, this is breathtaking in the pace that has been achieved and the promise that it carries along with it. So we're pretty excited about that, even as we know we still got a lot of work to do. So that was my opening sort of view of where we are with the disease, with therapeutics, with vaccines. But now I'd really like to hear what questions people have, and let's have at it.
Well, thank you very much. And we do have a number of questions for you, Dr. Collins. And let's start with what is currently within the realm of possibility in terms of approving a vaccine? What do you think in terms of still before the end of this year?
Well, let me walk you through the steps that have to be followed to get there, because I think that's really important. There's been a lot of concern about whether this warp speed means that corners are being cut and safety is being not treated with as much seriousness as it deserves, and that there's politics involved. And so let me walk you through what has to happen for such an approval to happen. I've already told you about the way in which the trials have to be designed, that they have to be very large and they have to be randomized and controlled. So this is the only way you really know whether something works. That's what we're doing. Now, if one of these vaccines comes to the point in the next month or so where it looks as if there's a significant number of people who got the vaccine who are protected against illness, that is, there are more cases in the placebo group than the vaccine group, and if it's looked as if over at least 2 months, since at least half of the people got the injections, that the safety issues are fine. You want to be sure there's not some sort of slightly delayed safety effect. If that happens, there is a data safety monitoring board, which is a group of individuals who don't work for companies. They are basically scientists and statistical experts. They're the only people who get to see that unblinded data. And they would then raise their hand and say, I think there's something here. And they would tell the company, okay, we think that you would want to look at this data and decide whether you agree that it's time to go to the FDA. And the company would look at it. All the company CEOs have said they don't want to submit to the FDA something that they don't believe is really good. So they might say, well, let's wait a little longer, but we'll see. If they decide it hits that mark, they go to the FDA. And the FDA looks at it, which is going to take a couple of weeks, and decide whether they think the data is totally compelling, because they're very into the details. They will hold a public meeting of the same group that met yesterday, the group called the VERB Pact, which stands for Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. That's kind of a mouthful. But this is a group also of distinguished experts who don't have any particular conflicts. They're just there trying to decide what's the right thing to do. That'll be a public meeting. Everybody will get to see, is the data compelling or not? And only then the FDA would consider issuing an emergency use authorization, which says that we're in the middle of a pandemic. The data looks really unconvincing. We're going to allow this to start to be distributed, but we still want to see more in terms of long-term follow-up to be sure there's no other consequence downstream. And then eventually there's something called a BLA that the company would get. And at that point, they'd have full approval. All of those steps have to be taken forward. And you're asking sort of, where are we now? Again, the first 2 vaccines that got started at the end of July will probably get to the point where they're DSMBs in maybe November. We'll look and say, I think there's enough here to say to the company, better have a look. Or they might not, because we don't know. Remember, vaccines are not usually 100% effective. Even the very best vaccines like measles is like 96% effective. And when you look at something like the flu, varies from year to year, but there are a lot of times where the flu vaccine is no better than about 50% or even a little less. FDA is not going to approve a vaccine that has less than 50% effectiveness. So, and we have no way of knowing until we see the data how these are going to do. Will they be like the measles? Will they be like the flu? Until you have the experience, you don't know. So I'm saying I'm cautiously optimistic that by the end of 2020, there will be at least one vaccine that has reached that stage of an emergency use authorization, but I don't know that for sure. And it might not happen, and it might take longer. And it might be that one of the other vaccines that's yet to get started, there are 2 more in the pipeline that'll start in the next couple of months, will turn out to be better. And it's a good thing we have this menu of diverse scientific approaches. If you were betting the whole thing on one vaccine, I'd be a lot more worried.
Okay, thank you. The Associated Press, working in partnership with Kaiser Health News, has undertaken a substantive look at public health departments across the country and reports that they currently lack the staff, the funding, the tools to distribute, administer, and track the doses to some 330 million people. How big a challenge is this going to be once we have a vaccine, and how do you see that resolved?
That's a great question, and it's a good thing we're thinking about that now and not waiting until the end of the year. All of the states were required to send their plans to the federal government a few days ago about how they would do this distribution part, thinking ahead about what kind of logistics would need to be addressed. The distribution to the states across the various localities that will need it has been pretty well mapped out already between the companies that will be making the doses, and they know what their capacity is going to be, and then the distributors, particularly places like McKesson. And let's be clear, this has been done before. This is not the first rodeo. The CDC oversees this for influenza vaccines every year, and about 80,000 doses 80 million doses go out there in a typical year. So the framework for achieving this is something that we have already had in place, but we're going to have to build on in a special way. I do think the questioner is right to point out that this is going to be a stretch. And we have, unfortunately, underfunded, undersupported health departments in this country. They have been allowed to slip into a phase of really very difficult financial stress because it just hasn't seemed to some people like a priority. And now here we are, and boy, is it a priority. So there's going to need to be a lot of attention to how to back up or backstop any of those efforts that look like they are going to be really stressed. But we're looking at that very intensively right now. That's the whole process that's in the middle of happening.
Thank you. You talked a few minutes ago about our being in perhaps the third bump of the first wave. To what do you attribute the current rise in COVID-19 cases across the country? And I'll just suggest some possibilities. Is it the cooler temperatures? Is it in-person schooling? Is it pandemic fatigue? Is it a combination of all of those and more?
It's probably a combination of all of those and more. I think the ones where you can really see what happened are often a sort of indoor gathering, sometimes of people who were just tired of the pandemic and wanted to party. Sometimes something as wonderful as a family reunion or a wedding or a choir practice. And without stringent attention to keeping physical distance and mask wearing and not congregating indoors, it is so easy for this to happen. And then you have a super spreader event. Recent estimates suggest that part of the reason why you're seeing so much COVID-19 in the Dakotas dates back to that Harley-Davidson Sturgis gathering. I'm a Harley-Davidson motorcycle rider, so I don't want to dump on bikers, but this was not a good thing. 500,000 people gathering in Sturgis without masks, congregating in bars, and having really no concern about this. And clearly there were infected people there. And then everybody got on their bikes and went back to where they came from and spread this around. We just can't afford to do that. It's pretty clear that certain holidays, Memorial Day, July 4th, Labor Day, are often followed 2 or 3 weeks later by a spike in cases. As I said at the beginning, there is no sort of high-tech solution to this right now. We're looking at one with vaccines, but the low-tech solution, which rests on the shoulders of every American, is you could be the one that's spreading this. Don't do it. Wear that mask, avoid that close proximity to others, watch your 6 feet. It's those 3 W's. Wear your mask, watch your distance, wash your hands. Keep that in mind. And that applies not just to vulnerable people, but to young people who may think they're immortal, but they could be the ones spreading this to their neighbors, their grandparents, and resulting in a terrible outcome. Unless we all think of it that way, this is just going to keep happening. And I'm afraid that's why we're in the pickle we are now. We have not in this country figured out how collectively to turn this into a circumstance where we could just drop the cases down to the baseline.
Given everything that you've just shared with us, how do you react and respond to the questioning of science by politicians, by pundits, and a scarily substantial percentage of the population? And is this what impact is that happening? is happening as a result.
It is troubling at a time where I think in many ways our best hope to get past this is to depend upon the full powers of the scientific method to find reliable methods of treatment and prevention. And yet there is a lot of suspicion about whether science is something you can trust. It reflects, I think, the fact that we have right now in this country a great deal of suspicion about everything and a great sense of division between sort of tribal attitudes. And scientists probably come across as sort of these elitists who think that we're smarter than everybody else. And maybe we don't do a very good job sometimes of communicating what we do and why you should trust it. And then on top of that, you have the cancer of social media conspiracies, which come at you 24 hours a day. And many people basically have that as their main feed of information. Some of those conspiracies are absolutely outrageous, and yet they seem to acquire followers who then become quite convinced that that's the source of truth. And it's hard to turn away from that if that's become sort of part of the way you look at the world. So yeah, it's kind of a perfect storm here of our culture being in a bit of a spasm of difficulty and divisiveness, sources of information that are unregulated and can very much then spread false information almost more rapidly than the true information. And scientists that are perhaps seen as a bit aloof and distant from what real people are experiencing. We got a lot of work to do there. When I look at the attitudes that are out there now about this vaccine and about who would be interested in taking it, it's really, really troubling. I've been talking so optimistically about how we are likely to have a vaccine by the end of the year. But if only 50% of Americans are interested in taking it, we're never going to get to that point of immunity across the population where this COVID-19 goes away. It could be here for years.
You mentioned tribal attitudes. Are we in a period when science is being questioned more than other times? You've been in this business a long time, or does it just feel this way because this is at the top story on the news every minute of every day?
Yeah, I don't want to make the mistake of saying this just came out of nowhere because it certainly has been a problem in other areas. Look at the whole debate about climate change, where it does seem that Americans have gotten polarized about that one. The scientific community would be absolutely, with very few exceptions, aligned to the perspective that climate change is very real, that it is a result of human activity, and that it is a threat to our planet of a substantial sort in the coming years, and we need to take action now. And yet the general public, for the most part, hasn't really quite seen it that way, although some have. So we've been in this issue for a while where this kind of scientific conclusion, even when it's very strongly supported by evidence, doesn't necessarily receive a warm public embrace. And that's particularly true if it tends to map across the divisions, the tribal forces in our country, as climate change has done, and as much of the discussions about whether you should wear a mask has also done.
You have a very warm and easy to understand methodology of explaining these things related to what we were talking about. Perhaps is one of the great challenges that scientists are facing today in translating their research and findings to the larger population, getting this down to understandable levels for I don't want to use the term average, but for more people, so that they get, in perhaps simpler terms, what we're dealing with here.
And I recognize that not all scientists are good at that. I'm fortunate to be surrounded by some who are world class in that regard. And I have to mention Tony Fauci in this particular context, because here is somebody who is probably the most highly respected infectious disease expert in the world. And I can have a conversation with Tony where we get deep into T-cell immunity, and he runs circles around me with what he knows and with the specifics of the scientific information. But he can also, in any setting that I've ever seen him, take these complicated concepts and turn them into compelling, evidence-based conclusions about what kind of public health measures we should be undertaking without a spin attached to that, just sort of telling it like it is. We need more Tony Fauci's. We don't have enough of them. A lot of scientists haven't really had enough experience in how to do that, and they sort of tend to slip back into using terminology that's off-putting because people don't quite understand which four-syllable word they just used and what it was supposed to mean. So we haven't done a great job, I think, in terms of educating our scientists about how to communicate what they do. They're excited. They like to do this. They want to tell this story. We are now working harder at that with our graduate students and our postdocs and our trainees to get people better prepared to be able to do an elevator speech about what you're working on in the lab and why somebody would care. So we're working on it, but it's not widely successful so far.
At one time, journalist Walter Cronkite was considered the most trusted man in America. And as you mentioned, you have an employee, Dr. Fauci, who today is considered by many to be the voice of knowledge and reason. How do you go about defending Dr. Fauci against some of the criticism that he's receiving for effectively doing his job?
Well, I don't have a problem defending him. It's actually pretty easy. I just say this is a dedicated public servant with intensely broad and deep knowledge about the problem we're facing. Somebody who's completely devoid of political connections, who has served 6 presidents since 1984. You can trust him because he has that track record, he has that knowledge. And if you didn't like what he had to say, well, okay, then look at the facts and try to figure out what we should do about that. But it is hard, it is somewhat distressing to see how some have demonized Tony basically for telling the truth. And now he has a full-time security force around him because of some of the threats that he and his family have received. And I guess I didn't expect to see that in the midst of this crisis, but here we are. It's a reflection of just how intense the feelings have become.
One of the challenges for journalists in the 24/7 news environment is the pressure to bypass the traditional process, which is gather, sort, report, and instead rush information out that has not gone through the sorting process. With this rush to find a viable vaccine for COVID-19, are we seeing a similar gather, report, and then sort process playing out with the research? In other words, is the public seeing, hearing, and reading about the processes, the sausage making, so to speak, on this, that would normally play out behind the curtain? And is that more confusing? Is that exciting? What are your thoughts on that?
On the positive side, I would say it's great for the public to have a window into how this all works. And you're right, this has never had the kind of attention and scrutiny in the public eye that this particular sort of set of steps in developing a vaccine has now led to stories in the press all over the place. I would bet that until a few weeks ago, most reporters and most members of the public had no idea what a DSMB is. Now it's like on the front page, the DSMB might be meeting soon to look at interim data from the vaccine trial. Goodness, this meeting yesterday of the Verb Pact that I mentioned, I think it was covered on C-SPAN. This is like one of those government committees that most people would hardly want to spend 5 minutes, and yet it was 6 hours on C-SPAN. So, but the good part is, I mean, we ought to be transparent. This is good. People ought to know exactly what we know, what we don't know, and see what the process is. I love that part. But it is challenging, I'm sure, for the press to figure out how to fold that into stories. I got to say, I've been very impressed for the most part with the way in which the press has tackled this situation. And I end up talking to reporters a lot, and I'm always glad to, as they're really delving into the details. And they're not just buying the first answer that comes to them from the first person they speak to. They're quizzing, they're asking skeptical questions if they don't quite see it that way. That's a pretty good thing. And I think if you look at the mainstream press right now, they're doing a fine job of telling this story at a level of detail the public has never heard before.
Thank you. A question from Ron Lloyd. There seems to be a small group of COVID-19 patients that continues to experience symptoms long term. Some of them have symptoms that mimic other illnesses. Could you comment on whether you've looked into this and what can be done to help both patient and groups?
I appreciate the question, and I've spent actually several hours in the last 24 hours working with some of my Institute director colleagues on a plan to investigate this more intensively, because there is something going on here that's quite troubling. That people who've had COVID-19, maybe even people who had fairly mild versions of the illness, aren't getting better, not all of them, when you'd think they would. If you get the influenza bug, a week later, you're going to be pretty much over it. With COVID-19, there is a subset of people now called the long haulers who seem not to actually recover for weeks at a time. They're still fatigued, they're still short of breath. If you do various analyses of their body's function, you start uncovering things that are troubling to see. For instance, a study just published a couple of weeks ago looked at Ohio State athletes. These are people in tip-top shape, women and men, who all had COVID-19. And then they looked at them a few weeks later by a very sophisticated cardiac MRI study. Fully half of them did not have normal cardiac function, and about 1 out of 7 had frank myocarditis, that is an inflammatory problem of the heart muscle. That was not expected. And if you look at people older who have been even sicker, the frequency of such cardiac abnormalities is even higher. Now, are those all going to get better? We don't know yet, but it is alarming to see this kind of consequence weeks after the acute illness. There are people who have this brain fog, which is also very troubling, which may linger also for weeks afterwards. And we don't know what that's about. Is that because of some inflammatory response that lingers? Is it that they've had some sort of vascular event? Because we know this virus can make blood clots happen, even in small vessels. We don't know. And this is going to be a very critical thing to now put a lot of effort into understanding. We need a lot more data to figure out how common is this? What are all the consequences of it? How long does it linger? How do we prevent it? How do we identify people who have the highest risk of these long-term consequences and intervene at the early moment? I don't have good answers to any of those questions. This is going to be one of the long-term questions that we're going to be wrestling with for a while.
Okay, thank you. Question from Andrew Scholl. Would you please talk about the characteristics that differentiate the first-generation vaccine candidates, especially what makes the candidates more suitable for distribution to specific populations?
Well, there are several different technologies that are being studied for vaccine development. Among the ones that Operation Warp Speed has chosen for the largest scale investment are 3 different ways. One is, and the ones that got out there first, is a new approach where you basically know the actual RNA sequence of the virus and you synthesize that same RNA. It's actually an RNA that codes for one of these spike proteins. And when you put that RNA in muscle, you just inject it into the muscle says, oh, I'm going to make a protein out of this. It makes a spike protein. The immune system goes, oh, I know what that is. I'm going to make an antibody. And there you go. This is very rapid because you don't have a lot of work to do to prepare the vaccine. It's messenger RNA wrapped up in a little lipid envelope. And that's why those were the first ones to get into phase 3 trials. But no mRNA vaccine like this has ever been approved by FDA. So this is a new technology, and we have to think about that. The next set, the vaccines that are being put forward by Johnson & Johnson and by AstraZeneca are based on using an adenovirus as the carrier for the gene for that same spike protein. And this is an approach that was successfully used for Ebola. So this is a vaccine vector that is thought to be safe and effective. And so we'll see how those go. And then two more are based upon an even simpler idea. Just purify that spike protein. Figure out how to make lots of it and use it as the thing that is the vaccine. Inject that into the muscle and let the immune system take it on. Those that are coming from Novavax and from Sanofi GSK are a little bit slower getting to us because those are harder to do. And there are a few other ways as well that people have done this, such as having a killed virus or a inactivated virus. Chinese are doing that. We are not doing those at the moment. Some concern about safety in that circumstance. So all of these have different pros and cons. Again, as I said, the good thing is we're not putting all of our eggs in any particular viral basket here. We're trying to diversify the approaches and increase the likelihood that one or more of these is going to work.
Andrew had a follow-up question, and I will ask it. I'm not sure whether you covered this in your first answer. Would you please talk about the inclusion of adjuvants in current trials and/or next-generation vaccines?
Great question. I did not cover it. So an adjuvant is basically a molecule that activates the immune system to react to something even more strongly than it would. And we've used adjuvants with lots of vaccines in order to get a really vigorous response. Yes, in fact, the last two vaccine platforms, vaccines that I mentioned, coming from Novavax and from Sanofi GSK, those are the protein subunits. Those both involve adjuvants.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here from member Bob Weiner, who wants to mention that his spouse, Pat Berg, was at NIH for 11 years. And they both have admired your work, and they are thrilled to have you here with us. Question: is COVID driving research support down for other critical illnesses and/or slowing work on them, like cancer, which also kills hundreds of thousands in the U.S. annually?
It's a very important question, and there's no doubt about the fact that this pandemic has had consequences for research in other areas. Take cancer, for instance. A lot of the research on cancer that required working at a lab bench had to be slowed down because researchers, to keep themselves safe, were basically having to work from home, and most of us don't have a lab bench at home. So in my own research laboratory at NIH, the 10 people that work for me on diabetes and on aging pretty much had to go home for about 3 months. Now, gradually, they've come back taking shifts and wearing masks. So everything that involved that kind of bench work got slowed down. And in terms of things that involve clinical trials or the need to enroll somebody in a trial in a clinic, because people were uneasy about coming to hospitals and clinics, those trials also slowed down in terms of their enrollment. And that's true for cancer and for lots of other things as well. So sadly, that has been one of the consequences. We are trying to keep that effort going as best as we can and bringing back very carefully as many of the staff as we can to be sure that we're doing then during the next few months, because this is not over yet, what is necessary to keep momentum going. But there's no question, one of the sad outcomes of this pandemic will be a slowdown in research on some other things that we thought were going to be going really fast right now.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions from Isaac Arnsdorf of ProPublica. First question is, what is the military's role in distributing a vaccine?
So the military has been an incredible supporter of Operation Warp Speed. General Perna, who is overseeing a lot of the logistics and the supply chain issues and the manufacturing, is quite an impressive expert in that space. And I've gotten to know a number of the folks in DOD that I didn't know before, and they've been wonderful colleagues. When it comes to the actual distribution, from what I understand, no member of the military will touch any of the doses that are on their way to somebody's arm. Basically, the doses will be manufactured by the companies and their manufacturing facilities. They will be shipped using shipping that is not military, and they will end up in appropriate distribution places, much of it managed by McKesson, which is a company, onto pharmacies and doctors' offices. So while the military has been incredibly helpful in designing the logistics for all this and making sure that we weren't going to have shortages of things like needles and vials, they will not be involved in the actual distribution of individual doses.
Okay, and second question from Isaac Arnsdorf. How will the Pfizer vaccine be able to reach rural and remote areas given its ultra-cold storage requirements and large minimum shipment size, 1,000 doses?
That's a very sophisticated and important question. Yeah, this is an issue. The Pfizer vaccine requires minus 90 degrees in order to keep it active. And that's not going to be trivial to achieve because lots of places will not have freezers sitting there waiting for something that needs to be kept at that temperature. If we have to figure out how to do it, there are ways that people have planned to distribute such freezers. So if Pfizer, for instance, ends up being the only approved vaccine, we'll just have to make this work. On the other hand, if we end up with more than one vaccine that turns out to be safe and effective, you can imagine this might be one of the ways in which distribution plans are made, that if you're needing to go to a place that doesn't have that kind of cold chain capability, that you might pick a different vaccine. In that regard, I think a lot of us are watching closely to see if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has been on a pause for about a week, starts up again, because it has some real advantages. First of all, it's a single dose. All of the other vaccines we're talking about require 2 doses. If you're trying to do something for people far away from the nearest medical care facility, it's really nice if you only have to see them once. And it also, the J&J vaccine will not require much in the way of a cold chain. It would be all right in a refrigerator. It doesn't need this ridiculously cold temperature of minus 90 degrees.
Thank you. Researchers in labs all over the world have worked tirelessly this year in the race to develop a viable COVID-19 vaccine. Some of our greatest scientific discoveries have happened by accident while trying to develop something else. Are there any new discoveries that are being made in the quest to develop a COVID-19 vaccine that are particularly exciting to you?
That's a good question, because we're always looking for those moments of serendipity where something happens that you did not expect and you don't want to just walk away from it. You want to go, what can I learn from that? I'm not sure in the vaccine arena I can immediately point to an example. I will say in the diagnostic arena, which is another part of what I'm trying to do, working with a program called RADx, which stands for Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics. We have been encouraging small businesses and academics who had ideas about how to develop new ways to detect the presence of this virus in a nasal swab or a saliva sample, to bring those forward. And we put them into what's called a Shark Tank. At least that's the term that Senators Blunt and Alexander have applied to it, because they were big fans of this project. And basically, those small businesses or academic investigators who are all kind of inventors get asked to defend their idea in front of a panel of business people and engineers and technologists and supply chain experts. And only a small fraction of them actually get through. But now, over the course of just since the end of April, we have now come up with 22 new technologies to do testing for the presence of that virus, which is breathtaking. And those are now being scaled up and getting ready to deploy. And some of those have in fact involved discoveries that I was not expecting to see. We all heard about CRISPR-Cas and its effort to use for gene editing. And again, that was the Nobel Prize to Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier just a couple of weeks ago. It turns out you can use CRISPR-Cas for diagnostics too, because it's really good at searching out and finding a particular genome sequence in a complicated mixture. And that's what you want to do if you're trying to decide if there's virus in somebody's nasal swab. That is very innovative. I don't think we would have seen that kind of insight or these kinds of inventions happening without this sudden motivation. And that's maybe an important point to say. There will be spin-offs here. We will, in the future, have better ways of making vaccines because of what we've learned with this one. We will have new platforms for doing diagnostics for other infectious diseases because of what we've been able to encourage for this one. So this is not just a one-shot deal. This is going to have some spin-offs. And maybe the next time, therefore, we'll be a little better prepared.
Question from member Alyssa Free. There have been reports of a possible link between blood types and COVID. Studies suggest that people with type O blood may have a lower risk of infection and a reduced likelihood of severe outcomes. What can you tell us about this?
That is a finding based upon a reasonably good sized study done in Europe. Basically, what they did was they looked at people who got very sick with COVID-19 and other people who got it but weren't nearly that sick. And they studied their DNA and said, is there something different here? And what do you know? It turned out that the O group people were less likely to be really severely ill. And the A, people with blood type A, were more likely. Now, it was not yes, no. It was not a big factor, but it was statistically significant. They then scanned the whole genome. And this is another cute little story. I'm not quite sure yet whether the final answer was in. And they found another place on chromosome 3 where there seemed to be a segment of DNA that predisposed people to get more sick. And when they went and looked at that particular piece of DNA on chromosome 3, and what do you know? This is one of that 4% of our genome that came from Neanderthals. And what do you know? It just happens to be in that space. Now I'm going to take a big leap here and say, okay, who has Neanderthal DNA on the planet? Well, pretty much everybody except Africans, because the Neanderthal crossbreeding happened in the Middle East and did not get back into Africa. Everybody came out of Africa, encountered the Neanderthals, they didn't go back. And so maybe this explains why so far COVID-19, despite the great fears many of us had, has not been as devastating in Africa as it has been in every other part of the world. That's a big leap. Nobody should hold me to that one.
Here's a question from Mike Fulton. China just joined the World Health Organization-led initiative to test and approve a COVID vaccine. The U.S., as we know, has opted out of that collaborative effort and is going it alone. Do you believe this was a prudent strategy, and what are the potential consequences there?
Yeah, this is the organization called COVAX, which tries to coordinate vaccine development. You know, we will figure out how to work with our international colleagues. Scientists have done that for decades. We are doing it now. We will continue to do it with or without this framework of COVAX. We will make sure that we're playing the best hand that we can. And I would just say for myself personally, if what we do with this vaccine development is just limited to helping Americans, then we have failed. We have a responsibility to the whole world, and places that don't have their own resources but have lots of this illness. We need to think about them too as we're going through the process of how to make enough doses so that everybody who needs one can get it. And I'm happy to say the companies that we're working with have that same view. We are going to be citizens of the whole global health arena, not just of the United States.
Here's our final question. This is a bit more philosophical for you. You've said that the principles of faith and science are complementary, and that as a young man exploring your own faith, you eventually concluded that atheism was the least rational choice because it takes the position of asserting a universal negative, which scientists in general are discouraged from doing. Do you think your faith has made you better at your job? A lot of people's faith has been shaken this year. What has helped you keep yours?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. Yeah, I was an atheist as a graduate student, and as a medical student encountering people who were facing the end of their lives, realized I hadn't really given much thought to those serious issues about why are we all here and what happens after you die, and why is there something instead of nothing, and all of those questions that generally get shoved aside when you're a young person who thinks you're going to live forever. And I became a believer in my late 20s, and that is very much a part of who I am. And at a time like this, my faith is more important to me than ever. I don't understand why terrible things are happening around us. I can kind of understand how it started with this transmission of this virus from a bat to a human, and maybe it says something about how we ought to be more careful about mixing together our environments of animals and people. But now that it's here, I can feel this sense of calling to try to do everything I can to help with that, and the people around me feel that too. And for me, that's a calling that's not just based upon a secular view, but also on a perspective of faith. And when I get up in the morning at 5 a.m., the first thing I do is to try to reconnect with that spiritual part of who I am before I get plunged into all of the daily challenges of what's coming at me. And maybe there's something about this terrible crisis that in some way can cause all of us to reflect a little bit about not just the material parts of life, but also the spiritual parts and who we are and who it is that we want to be. And what kind of calling do we have to help out those who are suffering and in need of some kind of comfort? I think we are all called to that. Where does that come from? For me, that comes from faith. That comes from going back and reading the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 and 6. It's an anchor for me that helps me in a storm.
We will allow that to be our final word today. Dr. Francis Collins, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for the chance to be on this program and to answer as many of these questions as I could. They were great.
We are pleased to present you with our National Press Club coffee mug. We'll get this to you, along with our hope that you will join us again in person in the very near future. Thank you.
I will look forward to that.
Thank you, good luck, and please be safe. We need you, sir. Our thanks to producer Lindsay Underwood, to our Headliners team co-leaders Donaline Juan-Leger and Lori Russo, and to our wonderful National Press Club team behind the scenes here in the Broadcast Operations Center. We thank our members and guests for your questions and for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and have a good day.